Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem.
This is Demai, chapter 2, halacha 1, and B'ezrat Hashem will be finishing up chapter 2, halacha 1 today. In the art scroll, we're on 17b1. The Mishnah now is going to be talking about rice that comes from outside of Eretz Yisrael. And we saw here in the Mishnah that the rice is going to be physically different from rice that comes from anywhere else. This rice is going to be pure white at the time. It's going to have this physical, distinctive feature, and that's going to make it so that it's presumed to have been grown in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore you're going to have to tithe it. So even if you're buying this rice in Chicago or New York or Oklahoma, when you're buying it, it's going to be presumed to be from in the land, and you're going to have to tithe it even though you are out of the land. That's a big chiddush, and we only learn that here in Demai chapter 2 halacha 1. We wouldn't have known that without this Mishnah. A brisa taught that the rice that is grown in the surroundings of Antioch is permitted in its locale without tithing. That's very surprising. Now, normally rice that is in Eretz Yisrael and rice that's out of Eretz Yisrael, they're going to be easy to tell one from the other. And the Eretz Yisrael rice is going to be very, very white. The other is going to be darker or off-colored. And because there's an obvious difference, if someone buys very white rice, even outside of Eretz Yisrael, it has to be tithed because you're assuming it came from Eretz Yisrael. And if you're buying the dark rice in Eretz Yisrael, it didn't come from Eretz Yisrael, so you don't have to tithe it because it's presumed to have come from outside of the land. Now, Antioch is a city in the Lebanon north of Eretz Yisrael, and there's going to be an exception to that. That's surprising. Now, the point here is that Antioch has very white rice as well, and the new point here in this Barisa's ruling is that we permit the very white rice of Antioch in Antioch and the area without surrounding. That's a big chiddush. However, outside of Antioch, the rice of Antioch is prohibited both in Eretz Yisrael and out of Eretz Yisrael. So this is very surprising. And so the Rosh, in his commentary in 2.1 here in the Mishnah, is pointing out that this is true even if we know for certain that the rice grew from outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael. That's a very big chiddush here. I want to look at Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's commentary on this, and he's writing like this to help explain it. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has a really good Beur in Zerayim, and great commentary in the Yerushalmi on Zerayim. And, you yourself, you're walking and looking at the Yerushalmi, and we're working on Zerayim, and we have all of these great rabbis who did this. You have the Chazan Ish, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and we have the Vilna Goan. Anyway, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein looks at it like this. He says that in Antioch, the majority of very white rice comes from Antioch, and therefore it's permitted. And in other places outside of Eretz Yisrael, the majority of very white rice comes from Eretz Yisrael, and it's therefore prohibited. But if we know for certain that a particular batch of rice is grown in Antioch, it's going to be permitted anywhere outside of the land of Eretz Yisrael. So what this is trying to point out is that Antioch also has this white rice. And if you know that this batch comes from Antioch, basically you can say that, okay, it's going to have the status of rice from outside of Eretz Yisrael because yes, even though it's white, you know that it came from Antioch. It didn't come from the land. And so even though it really looks like the white rice of Eretz Yisrael, nonetheless, it's going to be permitted without tithing. We're not worried that people are going to confuse the two. Why? Because you really understand and know that this particular batch comes from there. Now, this is going to be because the majority of the very white rice sold in Antioch is going to be homegrown. And we already learned before, we're going to follow the majority. So if you're in Antioch and there's white rice, in likelihood it came from a local area, and we follow the majority. Also, we know that just because it's white doesn't mean it came from the land. Big Hiddush. The Gemara is going to continue. It's going to talk about Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Yosef, permits very white rice from Antioch until Kadun, since the very white rice of Antioch is brought to the market as far as Kadun, and from Antioch to Kadun, the Antioch rice is found more commonly than the Eretz Yisrael rice, therefore you don't have to tithe it. The Gemara now is going to explain Rabbi Lazar's ruling, and Rabbi Yonah says that Rabbi Lazar, son of Rabbi Yosef, means from Antioch to Kadun, or a like distance in any direction. In other words, you draw a radius around Antioch because they're exporting from Antioch to the surrounding areas, to the marketplaces, and it's more likely that the rice, the majority of the rice, is coming from the Antioch area than it is coming from Eretz Yisrael. And even if it's unlabeled rice, and both of the rices are white, and if you're in a place around this radius, the majority of the rice in likelihood is coming from Antioch. We go by the majority. And that's why the ruling is going to be like that. Now the Gemara is going to talk about a brisa that's going to talk about the status of cities around Tyre. Again, Tyre is going to be the northwestern border of Eretz Yisrael. That's going to be north of Akko, north of Ketziv, south of Sidon. It's still a city that's there today. It's in the Lebanon. And the Mishnah in 1.3 is teaching that from Ketziv beyond, that's going to be not subject to Demai. It's going to be outside of the land. And according to the Mishnah in 1.3, Tyre is not going to be in the land of Eretz Yisrael, and it's going to be outside of that territory that was in the Ole Bavel territory. But there's something peculiar about it because these cities in the Tyre area were taken by returnees and therefore did become sanctified as part of Eretz Yisrael. So the cities are going to be listed, and therefore it's going to define the halachic borders of the area beyond Ketziv more precisely. Now, as to the status of Tyre itself, I want to look at the Chaim Kanievsky's commentary from Birkat Yisrael, or from his Beurim, and here's what he says about it. He's saying that there was a rabbinic obligation imposed upon foreign lands near Eretz Yisrael, particularly Moab and Ammon, to separate certain kinds of maestros for the benefit of the poor. And the same rabbinic obligation applies to Tyre. Alternatively, Tyre is obligated in Trumos and Maestros rabbinically because it's part of Syria. And the Mishnah is teaching the law of Syria with regards to Shvius. So in other words, one may work with detached produce in the normal manner, but not with attached produce. This, by the way, comes up in the Mishnah in Shvius 6.2. We just covered that. So the implication here, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is that there is no Shvius sanctity on the produce of Syria, and thus there's no prohibition to do business with the produce of Syria on Shemitah. This is also going to be true of Tyre. However, the cities bordering Tyre are part of Eretz Yisrael proper, and their produce does have full Shvius sanctity. So that's what this is trying to say. In other words, that part of these cities around Tyre did have Jews return from Ole Bavel. And so, as Rabbi Kanievsky is pointing out, these surrounding cities, while not Tyre itself, but these surrounding cities do have sanctity of the land. So the Gemara says these cities in the region of Tyre are prohibited. In other words, the produce would be prohibited because it'd have to be tithed. So one city is called Shetzes, one is called Betses, and Pai Matsuva, Upper Hanusa, Lower Hanusa, Bivara, then you have Rosh Maya, Amon, Mazi, and Mazi, and that's going to be the same as a place called Castilla today, a place called Castilla in the Lebanon area. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Mana says, this that you said, that only these cities in the Tyre area were sanctified, is accurate. And originally in Tanaic times, says Rabbi Mana, but now there are other cities the Jewish nation has taken possession of and are therefore prohibited. So Rabbi Moshe Feinstein explains about this like this. He's saying that if these cities were not acquired by the Ole Bavel and sanctified by them originally, why do they become sanctified now? It's a big question. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is saying possibly Rabbi Mana is reflecting the view held by some Achronim that the Ole Bavel borders can expand. And according to this view, parcels of land acquired in the Second Temple era, as long as long after Ezra's lifetime, can become sanctified as Eretz Yisrael and are going to be considered Ole Bavel territory. And similarly, areas in the Tyre region that were settled by Jews after the Tanaic era expanded the Ole Bavel territory. Also, another way to look at it is going to be that perhaps, these Jews moved to this quasi-sanctified area in Syria, and that's going to border Eretz Yisrael and Lebanon. And perhaps what Rabbi Mana is saying is that they could have been moving to this, Syria area. And Syria has this like quasi-Eretz Yisrael status. So the Brisa lists the prohibited cities of another region. And the Gemara says that the cities that are prohibited in the area of Susisa, and this is going to be a list independent of what we saw in the Tyre list. And by the way, Susisa itself is considered to be outside of Eretz Yisrael. We see that in Yerushalmi Shvius 8:3. Yerushalmi chapter 8 lists out cities that are outside of the land. Susisa is one of them. And the Gemara is going to cite a leniency regarding importing certain kinds of produce from outside of Eretz Yisrael to within Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah. And it's going to note over there in Shvius 8:3, it's going to note that an example would be somebody who imported produce from Susisa to Tiberias. And the Yerushalmi over there is going to explicitly say that Susisa is exempt from maestros. So, in terms of, where would this actually be, there are some sources who place Susisa near the south bank of the Sea of Galilee. Other people identify it as Hippos, one of the 10 Greco-Roman cities in the north. And the Yerushalmi in Ketubot states that the majority of Susisa's inhabitants were actually just non-Jews. So you'd have to check an ancient map on where that is. But here's the list. The cities that are prohibited in the area of Susisa, which would be Enosh, Ein Terah, Ben Berin. These are going to be, let me continue. Eon, Yadut, Kfar Charuv, Nov, Chaspia, Kfar Tzemach, And Rebbe exempted kfar tzemach from the requirements of Shemitah and tithes because he held that it was not part of the sanctified part of Eretz Yisrael. Some of these look like they might be in Eretz Yisrael today. So, and parts around the Galilee, parts around Bet Shean. So the Gemara is going to question Rebbe's ruling. By the way, Rebbe did a lot of research, as we're seeing in chapter 2 in Demai, about what was in the land and what was out of the land. So whereas Rabban Gamliel, before Rebbe ruled, he was a generation before, ruled that Caesarea Maritima was part of Eretz Yisrael. After a lot of research, Rebbe, who was specializing in where is the boundaries, ruled, and after a lot of research, conclusively showed that it was not part of Eretz Yisrael. So Rebbe is also exempting Kfar Tzemach. Rabbi Imi asks, and he says, but were the residents of Kfar Tzemach not among the taxpayers of the Jewish government? So, if so, why are they exempt from the requirement of tithes and shvius? I want to point out what's going on. So this comes up in Shvius chapter 6, Halacha 1. And Rabbi Yimi also poses the same question about the people of Susisa. And basically, you had Jewish people coming in the time of Yeshua and conquering. And some areas actually had where they stayed non-Jewish and they just agreed to pay a tax and to stay, but recognize Jewish sovereignty, recognize the 7 Noahide laws, and pay a tax. So basically, he's asking, isn't this really just conquered land? Even though it was non-Jewish, the people wanted to be a ger tzedek, wanted to observe 7 Noahide laws, and pay a tax to the Jewish government. What's the problem with that? And the Gemara is going to explain the premise of Rabbi Yimi's question. Rabbi Yimi held that a city that is among to say that these are the permitted cities in the region of Demai. In other words, it's trying to say that the produce in this area is going to be exempt from tithes because they're not part of the sanctified part of Eretz Yisrael. In other words, they were not conquered. And the Gemara continues. It says, Tzir, Tziria, Gashmai, Zivyon, Yigdai, Chatas, Davav, Harvasia, and the city of Bar Hizrog. Now, we might have thought from this sugya that we might have thought from this sugya that you have these areas and they're sort of like just floating in space with these names, like where's Chatas, where's Davav? And it's hard to place it where you have a place in terms of like any connection to any of these places. And there's actually a manuscript written in a mosaic that comes in Bet Shean. It's in a city in Rehov, and this ruin is about 1,350 years old, and you can go and visit it today, and it's very well preserved. It's the oldest copy of any fragment of Torah Shal Pei in existence. And actually, a lot of these cities are actually listed in this mosaic, which makes it so interesting because this mosaic is trying to lay out what is the boundary of the land for tithes. So the Gemara is going to conclude with two cases that when I was reviewing this, I found very interesting, very thought-provoking, because of what it's trying to get at. And when you read it in the shot, it's gonna seem very surprising. But when you dig into it, it's gonna make more sense. So here it goes. So the Gemara says a load of raisins entered Tiberias. Tiberias, by the way, is definite Eretz Yisrael. And the question arises as to whether these raisins came from a place that requires them to be tithed for Demai. And Gamliel Zuga asks Rabbi Ba Bar Chana. This is Rabbi Ba Bar Chana is the son of Kana. Kana was, the Yerushalmi calls him Kana, but this is Rabbi Kana from Babel who came to Eretz Yisrael. He was the student of Rabbi Yochanan. And he's asking, do these need to be tithed? Or perhaps, says the Pnei Moshe, it's during Shemitah, and he's asking, do these raisins have Shvius sanctity? Either way, if you have to worry about it for tithes, you certainly have to worry about it for Shemitah, and vice versa. And Rabbi Ba says to Gamliel Zuga, he says, the entire Eretz Yisrael cannot make up one standard load of raisins. And therefore we can conclude that these raisins came from outside of the land. They don't need to be tithed. And that seems very surprising. In other words, how could it be that Eretz Yisrael can't make up one standard load of raisins? How do you know that this is from outside of the land? Certainly, they're growing a lot of grapes here. What's going on? And the Gemara is going to challenge this because it seems very surprising. And the Gemara asks the same question that you're thinking. It says, can it be that the entire Eretz Yisrael can't make up one standard load of raisins? So certainly it can. They're growing a lot of grapes at this time, just like they do today. So what on earth does Rabbi Ba mean? And the Gemara is going to restate Rabbi Ba's reply to Gamliel Zuga. And the Gemara says, rather, this is what Rabbi Ba said to him. It says that there is no one place in Eretz Yisrael that can make up one standard load of raisins. And that again becomes very surprising. Why? And what this is trying to say is that most of the grapes grown in Eretz Yisrael at this time are being used to make wine, or they're being used as fresh fruit. And certainly the fresh fruit is going to be higher quality than dried fruit. We see this in maestros with separation of figs. We see like in Trumos maestros, can you separate fresh figs from dried figs? And the answer is, unless you're in a place that does this regularly, where they're making dried figs regularly, you can't, because the dried figs are to be considered lower quality produce. You can't do ties from higher quality produce onto lower quality produce. And likewise over here, the fresh fruit is going to be considered higher quality than the raisins. And because it's going to be considered higher quality than the raisins, we're going to say that, this is, being fully utilized in Eretz Yisrael, and they're not, turning into this lower quality produce, but maybe somewhere else is. And really, what this is trying to get at is that we can assume that he purchased, the load of raisins in one place, and we can conclude that it came from outside of the land, and it's going to be exempt from tithes because the practice at the time in this place is not to turn it into lower quality produce. The raisins are going to be considered lower quality produce than fresh grapes, and if you have so many fresh grapes that you can't eat them, you're just going to turn them into wine. And certainly Jews need a lot of wine more than non-Jews in surrounding areas, because we need to make it for Shabbat and for Kiddush and for enjoying Shabbat, and the Goyim in those areas don't have to worry about that. So it's more likely that the excess that they had over there would have been turned into raisins. That's the surprising Chiddush. There's a second case, and the Gemara says that a person once brought one large basket of leeks to Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Tavi in the Shemitah year. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Tavi asks Rabbi Yochanan whether we must be concerned that perhaps the leeks came from a sanctified part of Eretz Yisrael, and therefore it would be forbidden due to the prohibition of sfichin. And Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that it's clear from the end of the sugya that we're dealing with a shvius issue. And in a non-shvius year, a similar concern would exist as to whether these leeks would have to be tithed as Demai. So what we're seeing here is Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Tavi is worried specifically with these leeks about, the prohibition of sfichin. We know that perhaps these grew in the 7th year, and you're picking them in the 8th year. And you're saying, well, I picked them in the 8th year, but really these are just aftergrowths, and maybe this is going to be prohibited. So Rabbi Yochanan says to Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Tavi, go out and ask Hananiah ben Shmuel, who's an expert in in Baraisos. And this, by the way, continues, and he says he went out and asked Hananiah and Shmuel this question, expecting him to cite a brisa. And Hananiah ben Shmuel says, I did not see a brisa that is relevant to the question. And Rabbi Kanievsky explains that the wording I did not see implies that the brisos were written down. Nevertheless, the brisos were taught in public orally, and they were written down only to prevent any loss from forgetting. So, interesting insight by Rabbi Kanievsky. And the Gemara says, but I was told in oral teaching, for Rabbi Yassa says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon disagree about the matter. In other words, there's a lot of disagreements between Rebbe and the son of Shimon bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar. And the Gemara continues and says, one says that we go after his origin, in other words, the place where the transporter came from. And the other says that we go after his standing location, in other words, the place from where the produce is delivered. And it doesn't say, who says what, but the idea, says the Panei Moshe, is, that one opinion that we go after the place where the produce is brought to is going to result in a lenient or stringent ruling. And that's what the Gemara is going to note, that we're speaking about large baskets, and we can assume that the merchant purchased the produce close to where it's being delivered. And it would not be customary to transport produce in these large baskets over a large distance. So the other opinion would be that if the transporter originated from a far off place, perhaps he transported it from a place where he came from, and in this case, it would not make any difference, and in terms of whether you would have a strict or stringent ruling. But this large basket issue, this is going to end up where you might have strict rulings. So there's another Amora who identifies the author of each opinion. So Rabbi Abahu, also a student of Rabbi Yochanan, explained, Rabbi is the one who says that we go after his origin. Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon is the one who says we go after the standing location. And Rabbi Abahu adds another point. He says, and Rabbi Abahu said further, although Rabbi Yochanan explained that Rebbe is the one who says that we go after his origin, Rabbi Yochanan himself ruled for me in accordance with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon that we go after his standing location. And in this case, the man who brought the basket would be from Eretz Yisrael, and the place that he brought it from, the place to which he brought it was Chutz La'aretz. So in this case, Rabbi Yochanan would permit the produce. In other words, in this ruling, which is remarkable, he's talking about the reverse case, talking about a man who came from Eretz Yisrael, and this, Rabbi Abahu was Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land, and they brought leeks from out of the land, or from in the land, or disguised from in the land, and Rabbi Abahu buys these leeks from outside of the land. He wants to know, at this time, from Rabbi Yochanan, what do I do with these leeks? Do I have to tie them or not? The case that we were just talking about with Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Tavi is the opposite case. We're talking about a man who came from outside of the land, and he bought these leeks inside of the land. And Rabbi Abahu is experiencing it where he's ruling like the son of Rabbi Shimon, and he's saying that, treat these leeks as if, it's like with these large baskets, and treat it like where he's standing. In other words, assume that he bought it along the way, Chutz La'aretz, and you bought it Chutz La'aretz, and it's produce of Chutz La'aretz. Now, the question is, but, if he's buying it in the land, and you're going to rule like Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, you're going to end up with a stringent ruling, because you would say, this produce is going to be subject to shvichin laws, and in another year, it'd be subject to Demai. So the Gemara is going to hone in on this dispute between Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, and the Gemara says that this was stated in regard to these large baskets that are capable of carrying only small loads, and therefore not used for transporting produce a very far distance. However, regarding those large camel loads of produce, everyone agrees we go after his origin. So if you have these very, very large camel sacks and loads, it's clear he, bought the stuff from wherever he started out, and he's bringing it to the new city. And basically, there's no dispute with this. Merchants are going to try to transport large loads of produce from distant locations. And so even Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon is going to agree that we go after the merchant's origin. But we're dealing here with these baskets. What do you do with these baskets that are not fit for transporting over a large distance? It's not convenient. You would, if you're starting out on a journey, this is not what you would ever use. So the Gemara is going to hone in on this point a little bit further. It's going to say that if his origin and his standing location were both permitted locations, in other words, outside of Eretz Yisrael, and he transported the produce by the way of a forbidden location, Eretz Yisrael. In other words, let's say he started Chutz La'aretz and he ends up Chutz La'aretz, but in the way he goes through Eretz Yisrael. What's the status? And the Gemara says that we view that forbidden location as if he had never transported it through there. In other words, we're not worried about the possibility that he acquired produce in the stretch of Eretz Yisrael that he entered and that he passed through. And we're not worried that the produce should be subject to the laws of Shvius. So that's an interesting possibility, but we're not worried about if he was out of the land and ended up out of the land and just went through the land on his journey. We don't consider it. So the Gemara is going to go back to Rabbi Abahu's second statement about this ruling that Rabbi Yochanan gets in accordance with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, that we go after the standing location, because it's a big hiddush. And we're going to see something very interesting at the end of this. So the Gemara is puzzled by this, and Rabbi Bar Cohen Bar Kana inquires in the presence of Rabbi Yossi. In other words, he's asking the same question you are. How could it be that Rabbi Yochanan rules in accordance with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon over Rebbe? And the Gemara says, did Rabbi Chia bar Va not say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan himself in a dispute between Rebbe and a colleague, the halacha follows Rebbe? And certainly we know that in a dispute between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon bar Yochai, that the halacha is always going to follow Rebbe. And the Gemara continues. It says, furthermore, Rabbi Yonah stated, this rule is true even regarding the disputes between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon. So how on earth could Rabbi Yochanan rule in accordance with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon? In other words, he's saying they should have ruled like Rebbe. The Gemara is going to explain. Rabbi Yossi says to Rabbi Ba, what do you want from Rabbi Yochanan? Why Rabbi Yochanan follows his own reasoning and rules like Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon only in this case? For Rabbi Yochanan said, the reason I ruled leniently in this case is because the rabbis were particularly lenient with regards to Shvius laws, which nowadays are enforced by rabbinic decree only. So Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon was considered the greatest Torah scholar of his generation, and by the way, considered to be an even superior Torah scholar than Rebbe. But Rabbi Yochanan is ruling a little bit different. Okay, he's ruling leniently, and certainly the case of Rabbi Abahu is very lenient. We see these leaks outside of the land. Rabbi Abahu buys these leaks outside of the land, and he rules, treat it like outside of the land, like he's transporting it in these smaller baskets, and don't treat it like, the merchant came from Eretz Yisrael, where the merchant did come from Eretz Yisrael and transport these leaks from Eretz Yisrael. Treat it leniently. And why is he saying it's lenient? Because he's saying that nowadays anyway, the Shvius laws, like the Demai laws and the tithing laws, are rabbinic anyway. So that's why he's giving a lenient answer. And so it doesn't look like he's actually, ruling over Rebbe. He's just saying, normally speaking, these laws are going to be treated leniently anyway. And so, at a time when everything's d'oraita, sure, let's go by Rebbe on this. But in a time when anyway it's going to be lenient, let's give the lenient opinion. Certainly, the opinion in the case of exporting out of Eretz Yisrael, or a merchant potentially exporting outside of Eretz Yisrael, or maybe buying the produce along the way, and then buying the produce outside of Eretz Yisrael and not tithing it or subjecting it to Shvius sanctity, it's a very lenient ruling. And he's saying, anyway, the Shvius laws are enforced by rabbinic decree anyway. They're not d'oraita right now. So if we have a question as to whether the produce came from Eretz Yisrael or outside of Eretz Yisrael, in terms of Sfichin or other Shvius laws, we're going to assume the lenient position, and we're going to assume that it came from outside of the land. There's another explanation that I find to be very interesting. And the Gemara says, alternatively, some say the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan should be combined with that of Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, and they therefore outnumber Rebbe. That is really a chiddush, and I want to point out what Rabbi Kanievsky says about this. He says that that's not to say that Rabbi Yochanan, who was an Amorah, could argue with Rebbe, who's a Tana. Rather, Rabbi Yochanan is acting as a decisor based on his own logic and concluded that the halacha should rest with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon. And the Alei Tamar, who was a great commentator in the Yerushalmi in the 60s and 70s, around Bnei Brak, really fantastic commentary. He says that others derived this statement that, in fact, the Yerushalmi holds that Rabbi Yochanan was a Tana and could therefore dispute an opinion of Rebbe. So that's also a very interesting idea. But I prefer to look at the leniency that is given in the sugya before for why he goes with Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon. In other words, he's holding that normally speaking, we're going by Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon in this one case because anyway, the agricultural laws are d'Rabbanan until the tribes are settled back into the land at the correct location, certainly for Shvius. Anyway, have a great day, and that concludes Chapter 2, Halacha 1, and we're going to get to Chapter 2, Halacha 2 tomorrow. Thanks so much.